Behind the smiling faces of the most ordinary people, we may find a dark madness that can engulf our lives with no warning. Rampage, Killing Without Reason, explores the terrible acts of the world's most notorious mass killers, who erupted into the headlines with a trail of death and destruction in their wake. This chilling and riveting series lays bare the psychology, motivation, and bloody history of this new and terrifying phenomenon, mass murder. Children brought to school, brought there to learn. But they are also brought there because it is supposed to be safe. American schools are entrusted with the safety of our children. That all changed in the 1990s when schools became places of mass murder. Colleges and universities are not safe. High schools are not safe. Junior high schools are especially not safe. Even elementary schools are not safe from the rampage of this new kind of mass murder. In 1966, Charles Whitman shattered the peace and tranquility of the University of Texas campus when he shot and killed 14 and wounded 30 more. But rather than a school massacre, this case, this rampage, was dubbed a public killing. The killing of a crazy man who happened to pick a school for his mass executions. 30 years later, the unexpected happened. A monstrous new kind of mass murderer emerged, the kid who kills other kids. It began in 1996 at a middle school in the small town of Moses Lake, located on the windswept eastern plains of Washington state. Barry Lukaitis, a mere 14-year-old, dressed up as a Wild West gunslinger. Wearing a black duster and armed with a .30-30 hunting rifle and 2 handguns, he set off for school on February 2nd.
Barry Lukaitis went into his middle school and into his math class and started shooting, killing a teacher, killing a fellow student. And on the way out, he did indeed say, "This sure beats algebra." Very odd, unusual line. He was captured and prosecuted.
In the end, the algebra teacher and 2 fellow students were shot dead. Another was wounded. How could a teenager, just 14 years old, do such a thing? A simple and clear answer was demanded. It was said he got the idea from the movie Natural Born Killers, which romanticized the epic spree killing of Charles Starkweather and Carol Ann Fugate 40 years earlier. Others claimed the idea for his rampage came from Stephen King's novel Rage.
There are all kinds of myths about mass murder, old-time ones and modern ones. One of the most interesting is the myth that Barry Lukaitis got the line, "It sure beats algebra, don't it?" from a Stephen King story, Rage. He was a fan of the book Rage. He had a copy, it's well tattered, well read. But if you go through the pages of Rage, there's no such comment. The closest is, "This sure beats panty raids." So the idea that he took this line from the pages of Rage came from a New York Times story. All the news that fits the print, the authoritative paper. Well, that story, that myth that he copied that line, has circulated for years and has taken on a life of its own. It's just not true. He may have been inspired by King's story because it was a very similar episode in Rage, written by King's pen name, Richard Bachman. And I know that Stephen King to this day regrets having written that and published it and requested of his publisher to be taken out of print. But if it weren't that, there would have been something else. That Barry Loukaitis had everything necessary to get even with in a violent way.
Getting even with bullies. Dr. James Fox and Dr. Jack Levin were the first to write a book on mass murder. They both see a common thread in early school massacres.
In almost every case of a school massacre, the killer or the killers, when there's a team, have been bullied, teased, ridiculed, humiliated, and not just for a few days. It's usually over a period of years, to the point where they just can't take it anymore. They blame their classmates. They blame their schoolmates. They may even blame their parents and their teachers. And they decide that they're going to get even. You know, if they were 35, they might do the same thing at work. They may, after being fired, kill the boss, kill their coworkers, feel that there's some kind of conspiracy against them at the office. But this is the office. The school is the workplace for these youngsters who are 14, 15, 16 years of age. And actually, bullying peaks in the 6th grade. And that's why you get so many of these massacres that are committed by middle school students, not just the ones who are in high school or in their last year and ready to go to college. No. They're much more likely to happen in middle school, where there's a lack of maturity. Someone once said that every 8th grader is emotionally disturbed. Well, that's an obvious hyperbole, but at the same time, it does point out that, you know, it's a transitional period, and being rejected by one's peers when you're an 8th grader is tantamount to getting the death penalty for someone who's much older. You just don't want to be rejected by your friends because you're dead in any psychological sense.
Many people ask, what's the matter with kids today when they see school shootings occur? Well, in many regards, kids are no different than they were in previous generations. We've had alienated adolescents for as long as we've had teenagers, and I think that's a long period of time. We've had schoolyard bullying for as long as they've been schools, and that's a long time too. If there is any difference, well, partially it's in the weaponry available, and that's also in the role model. That is, 20 years ago, someone who is angry at the school, angry at the classmates, wouldn't even consider, wouldn't even think of bringing a gun to school, wouldn't even cross his mind. Maybe he'd break a few windows or vandalize the classroom. But murder just wasn't an option. But now the message, the example has been set, and contagion very much does control. That a child now, feeling angry, resentful, wanting to get even, has a role model in lots of school shooters.
Once the Barry Loukaitis school shooting was broadcast across the nation by the popular media, the disease, the contagion, the school shooting of kids by other kids, spread like wildfire. Who would be the next innocent victims? Who would be the next teen mass murderer? The answers came all too quickly, were all too deadly. When students returned to school in 1997, school massacres would become an epidemic. And the contagion would not stop until the beginning of the next century. The next stop on its spread occurred in Pearl, Mississippi. On October 1st, 16-year-old Luke Woodham, after stabbing his mother to death, drove to his high school. Entering the school wearing an orange jumpsuit and cloaked in a trench coat, he shot and killed 2 girls. One was his ex-girlfriend. He shot them both with a rifle. Luke then went on to wound 7 others. Throughout his school days, he had been bullied, and when the assistant principal finally subdued him, he cried out, "Why did you shoot my kids?" Woodham answered calmly, "Life has wronged me, sir." Later, a message written to a friend before the shooting emerged. "I am not insane. I am angry. I killed because people like me are mistreated every day. I did this to show society, push us, and we will push back. All throughout my life, I was ridiculed, always beaten, always hated. Can you, society, truly blame me for what I do? Yes, you will. It was not a cry for attention. It was not a cry for help. It was a scream in sheer agony, saying that if you can't pry your eyes open, if I can't do it through pacifism, if I can't show you through the displaying of intelligence, then I will do it with a bullet.
If you think about the mass killings that have occurred in school settings, high school, colleges, and universities, there too you find a range of explanatory factors. So there are cases where the perpetrator felt bullied, isolated, victimized by other students. I never quite fit in, I was the loner. 16-year-olds who feel bullied, who are loners, who are into weapons and fantasy are at risk in these circumstances. There are other cases where the evidence tilts much more convincingly toward mental illness, where it's not so much the perpetrator who feels bullied, but you have somebody who is convinced that all those other students at that school are talking about them, where there's evidence of schizophrenia. There's a history of mental illness. Those are very different kinds of cases. And then I think there's a third type, where you see a combination of a history of isolation at the school, a history of bullying. These are kids who always sit alone in the cafeteria. They might try to sit with other students, and those students move away. These are the students who feel left out. They're either not picked to be on the baseball team during recess, or they're picked last. People do make fun of them. They're scapegoats. There is that quality. And, at the same time, that may be the very same kid who has struggled with clinical depression, who has struggled with bipolar disorder, who has struggled with schizophrenia. That combination can be deadly.
Such was the case with 14-year-old Michael Carneal in West Paducah, Kentucky. As with Barry Lukitis before him, Michael was a lover of Stephen King's novel Rage. An expert marksman in video games, Michael would put his skills to work in real life.
Michael Carneal in West Paducah, Kentucky, went to his high school and opened fire at a prayer service, killing 3 and wounding 5 fellow students. He apparently had been suffering some onset of mental disease, In fact, later there was a lawsuit by some of the victims' families for video game manufacturers and for the producers of the movie The Basketball Diaries for unduly influencing him into perpetrating these murders. The suit was dismissed. Stephen King, whose novel Rage was found in Michael Carneal's locker, subsequently requested that his publisher allow the book to go out of print because of its connection with the crime.
With both Woodham and Carneal, all the dead were girls, leading to the myth about male teen school shooters.
One recurrent theory about school shootings is that they're primarily anti-female, anti-girl, that killers are targeting female students, not male students. Well, there have been a couple who've particularly gone after girls. But if you look at the collection of victims of schoolyard rampages, girls represent just under half of the victims, not a majority.
Nevertheless, 5 months after the Carneal school rampage, in Jonesboro, Arkansas, 4 more girls aged 10 to 11 would be dead, along with a female teacher. The perpetrators were 13-year-old Mitchell Johnson and 11-year-old Andrew Golden. They were the first of the buddy school killers. They were the classic bad seeds. Bad seeds who bullied other students, picked fights, wanted to join a high-profile gang like the Bloods or Crips, killed and tortured pets. They were on the road to becoming serial killers. Supposedly, Golden, the younger of the two, approached Johnson with a plan for murder. "Let's start a spree killing at our school." They raided the home of Golden's grandfather, stealing 2 semi-automatic weapons, a rifle and 4 pistols. Then, on March 24th, they set up an ambush outside of Westside Middle School. Golden sneaked inside and set off the fire alarm. The trap was set. When students and teachers poured out of the building, Golden and Johnson opened fire and massacred them. In addition to the 5 dead, 10 more were wounded. The school massacre contagion spread like an uncontrolled fire. Its next stop was Springfield, Oregon.
In Oregon, we have the case of Kip Kinkle. In his story, there was a gun that was stolen from the family of a friend of his at school. Kip bought the gun from the person who stole it and had it at school. When there was a search of his locker, they found the gun and he was expelled from school. The next day he went to the school armed with a Glock 9mm pistol and a Ruger rifle, as well as a knife, and 1,100 rounds of ammunition. He opened fire, killing 2, and kept firing with the Ruger rifle until it was empty, 50-shot magazine. He was then attempting to pull out the Glock pistol when he was overcome by fellow students.
2 dead male students and 25 injured by Kinkle's spray of bullets. By the murderous rampage of yet another white rural male teen killer.
You can see copycatting and contagion in the mass shootings in schoolyards in the late 1990s, when over a 2-3 year period of time, there were as many as 6 or 7 multiple homicides, all by white kids from rural towns and small towns who identified with perhaps the other white kids in small towns and rural areas who went on rampages, who got even with all the bullies and all the nasty teachers, and they saw them as heroes.
Such was not the case with the horror of all school massacres. a massacre so terrible it is known simply as Columbine. Here, the perpetrators came from a wealthy suburban neighborhood. It was the most stunning live national television event until 9/11 2 years later. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold terrorized Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado for the better part of a day. They called themselves the Trenchcoat Mafia. On Tuesday, April 20th, 1999, a date planned to coincide with the anniversaries of the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 and the government debacle with the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas 2 years before that, Klebold and Harris entered the school grounds of Columbine High School armed to the teeth. What they did next is almost unimaginable. They began to systematically execute their classmates. Targeting black students, athletes, and religious girls, they moved from the grounds surrounding the school into the halls and finally into the library, killing as many as they could. They killed calmly, even joyfully.
Witnesses to mass shootings often talk about the fact that the gunman was so calm, maybe even smiling. Well, that's partially because they need to be calm in order to carry out a methodical execution. If they were nervous and shaking, they wouldn't be able to shoot straight. So it's partly a necessary condition to have that degree of calm. But it's more than that. It's also the fact that, like individuals who decide that they're going to commit suicide and oftentimes look very calm and peaceful in the days leading up to the suicide, these guys have decided what they're going to do, and they're comfortable with it. So of course they're calm when they're doing it. They're doing what they want to do. They're getting the kind of satisfaction and revenge that they seek. And while they're smiling, well, many of them are happy about the fact that others are dying at their hand.
And there were 12 students and 1 teacher. Outside the school, the drama and tension were palpable. SWAT teams swarmed everywhere. Confusion reigned. Kids jumped from second-story windows. Students embraced each other, screaming and crying. And nobody knew for sure what was going on. Was it another homegrown terrorist attack? Reports from students who had escaped the school spoke of a paramilitary operation. But who? Nobody knew for sure. Columbine was a big high school.
Usually when there's a paramilitary component, there's evidence of this deep-seated, seething hatred for government. So you find these kind of right-wing, anti-government, separatist movement perpetrators who blow up buildings where there are government offices. I don't see that in Columbine. There may be a paramilitary component to it, but I'm not aware of notes that were left about why we hate the government. I don't recall any evidence suggesting that they believe that the state or federal government is the source of all evil. Maybe it's because they were adolescents and there was this very kind of simplistic, naive quality to this paramilitary component. But to me, it seems qualitatively different from what I typically see when adults engage in these paramilitary-laced assaults.
The assault started outside of the school. At 11:19 a.m., witnesses heard Harris yell, "Go! Go!" the two teens pulled out their guns and began shooting. First to die was Rachel Scott, shot in the head, torso, and leg. Her friend, Richard Castaldo, was shot 8 times, but survived. Next to die was Daniel Rohrbach, shot dead on the stairs leading up to the school doors. Students lying on the stairs already wounded were shot again as Harris and Klebold stepped over them. Shooting at anything and everyone that moved, at least 7 more teens were wounded on the ground surrounding Columbine. Entering the building, the 2 killers wounded even more, including teachers Patty Nielsen and Dave Saunders. Heroically, Saunders was evacuating students when he and another pupil encountered Harris and Klebold heading down a hallway. Saunders was hit in the chest and eventually bled to death. But the real massacre was yet to happen in the library. When it was all over, 10 more would lie dead. Not only did the 2 mass murderers execute their victims, they taunted them before they died. Exchanging fire with the cops outside, the 2 boys continued looking under tables for new targets. No longer getting a rush from simply shooting their victims, Klebold suggested to Harris, "Maybe we should start knifing people. That would be more fun." Fortunately for everybody involved, the homemade bombs that these 2 manufactured never worked. Otherwise, the deaths might have been tenfold. At 11:42 a.m., the pair walked out of the library a mere 23 minutes after it began. 23 minutes of death. 1 person killed every 2 minutes. It would be another 4 hours before some of the survivors in the library would be rescued. Although no one else was killed, Harris and Klebold continued to wander throughout the school, shooting from the windows at the cops, taunting the students, telling them they were going to die. Caught on security cameras, the pair was seen wandering through the cafeteria. Re-entering the library at 12:02, they engaged the cops outside with more gunfire. 6 minutes later, they shot themselves, falling dead next to 2 of their victims, Matthew Kechter and Isaiah Scholes. When the carnage was over, a new phrase had entered our lexicon: doing a Columbine. Columbine stirred much controversy. It raised questions about America's policy regarding guns and gun control, particularly the nation's leniency towards ownership of military-type assault weapons. Oscar-winning documentary filmmaker Michael Moore even did a film about the case and issue. He called it Bowling for Columbine, the title coming from the ironic twist that Harris was chided for skipping his bowling class, skipping it in order to commit mass murder. A mass murder that to this day still confuses the experts.
In the aftermath of any mass killing, you tend to see analyses of the killers' backgrounds, their biographies, their histories. Oftentimes you have to look not at their individual pathologies, but at the pathological nature of their friendship. I suspect that Columbine would not have occurred had Klebold and Harris not been buddies. Certainly, Klebold would not be the kind to go on a rampage had it not been for his relationship with Harris. Sometimes these horrific crimes occur because of a perverted form of male bonding, showing each other their camaraderie, their loyalty, their friendship, and that to some extent the victims of Columbine were pawns to the relationship and the bond that Klebold and Harris were sharing.
Columbine fits the profile. You've got two misfits, two young guys who felt like outsiders. They had been terrorized and humiliated and bullied for a long period of time. They had joined up with a kind of a delinquent group that was really not in the mainstream of the school. They fit the profile demographically. They're like most of the other school shooters, white young guys who had been bullied in a suburban school, not an inner city. Sure, they look like other school shooters. They act like other school shooters, and they were motivated like other school shooters. The difference is that they killed 13 people. And this became such a high-profile case that it spawned a number of other school shootings and aborted school shootings and false alarms during final exam period. The Columbine massacre assumes such importance that it became part of our vocabulary. If a massacre occurred after that point, and that was April 1999, it was called doing a Columbine. It assumed the same importance that the post office massacres had in the 1980s and 90s, when the term going postal became part of our vocabulary.
You know, the Columbine case, I think, is very mysterious. There's so many cases of mass killings where there's a pretty clear explanation, whether it's racism or anti-Semitism or the political agenda, I hate government and I'm going to blow up this building, where there's mental illness. For me, and I think for many, Columbine is mysterious because a single explanation doesn't leap out of the complex circumstances. And I think to this day, there's an awful lot of speculation about what was going on for these two guys. Was this revenge? Was this rage? Were they trying to make a political statement? Were they adolescents behaving in this incredibly juvenile way, not realizing the impact of their behavior? And so to this day, I'm willing to believe I don't fully understand Columbine. It doesn't fit the patterns that I usually see.
So much significance is given to the Columbine case. Sure, it does represent the watershed case, the worst high school, at least, school shooting that there has been. But had Columbine happened by itself, without other shooters before that, we would have seen it as an aberration, not as a trend. Had Columbine happened, but not West Paducah and not Pearl and not Jonesboro, our whole approach to that case would have been different. We wouldn't have seen this national obsession with school violence and school shooting because we would have considered Columbine an oddity, an aberration, not an epidemic.
After Columbine, the contagion for school massacres began dying out. Columbine had brought about new measures in school security. Greater attention was paid to bullying. School administrators and teachers now took seriously early warning signs, particularly violent threats. All these new measures were paying off. There were still school shootings, but no massacres. In 2000, 2 were killed in Savannah, Georgia. 1 in Lake Worth, Florida. In 2001, One more student died by gunfire in Gary, Indiana, and 2 in Santee, California. A principal was killed by a handgun in Red Lion, Pennsylvania in 2003, as were 2 students in Cold Springs, Minnesota. Then came 2005.
In 2005, 16-year-old Jeffrey Weiss killed 9 of his classmates before committing suicide. Like a lot of mass public shooters, he had let others know beforehand what his intentions were. That's why with a lot of these cases, those who knew the mass murderer are seldom surprised when the event actually occurs. And this was true with Weiss, as he had notified those who knew him that he was planning on doing that.
There are occasions when a person's actions prior to a crime indicate the direction that they might be going. In the case of Jeffrey Weiss, a Native American student, there was a few red flags that might have let people know what was going to happen, including an animated video which he posted on the internet showing a killer murdering a variety of innocent people until he finally put the gun in his own mouth. Weiss lived up to the video that he'd made by going to his high school, murdering 5 fellow students, an unarmed security guard, and then killing himself.
Grant Dewey is a corrections officer for the state of Minnesota. He has written a book on the history of mass murder and sees simple revenge as the primary motive for all the K-12 shootings.
With juveniles, the ones who have been responsible for the school shootings, it's different because they're not involved. They're not married, of course, and they're typically not employed. Instead, it's an event that appears catastrophic to them. It could involve loss of face with peers in their school. It could be the loss of an important relationship. But generally speaking, the reasons seem to be a little more trivial than they might be with adult shooters. And that's kind of what we see with Kip Kinkle, in addition to Columbine, as well as the mass public shooting that took place in Minnesota at Red Lake by Jeffrey Weiss. And so all of these cases involved offenders who were motivated to exact revenge on those whom they felt had mistreated them in some way.
Perhaps more perplexing, and certainly sicker than kids who kill kids on school grounds, are the adults who turn their rampage towards our schools and inflict mass murder on our school children.
Back in the late 1980s, there were nearly a dozen cases of adults who went on school grounds and started shooting. Not all of them were fatal. Lori Dan was well known because she went into a schoolyard in Winnetka, Illinois. She made the cover of People magazine. And she had a fan, a Lori Dan fan, his name was Jamie Wilson, who wanted to do exactly what she did. He talked about her all the time. He had clippings about her. He had her picture pinned on his wall. And he went into his schoolyard in South Carolina and killed 2. The contagion of school shootings continued until the largest case in Stockton, California, at the Cleveland Elementary School. Then the contagion evaporated. But it reemerged several years later when there was a series of 3 episodes in America, and within a week period of time, of adults who targeted school children. Another instance of potential copycatting.
This deadly contagion reemerged 1 year after Jeffrey Weiss's Red Lake, Minnesota massacre.
On the morning of October 2nd, 2006, Charles Roberts walked into a rural schoolhouse in Amish country, rural Pennsylvania, and he killed 5 young girls, execution style, before he was stopped. Interesting that just days earlier, a 53-year-old man in Bailey, Colorado, walked into a rural schoolhouse and sexually abused a number of teenage girls and then killed one of them. His intention was to kill all of them, but fortunately he was stopped before he could do it. The copycat factor is so pronounced in these 2 cases, because in Colorado and in Amish country in Pennsylvania, the killers went into a rural schoolhouse. Both of them had the intention of sexually abusing the girls. They chose girls as the victims. And both of the killers were white males. And that's the way the copycat phenomenon works.
Rage perpetrated on our innocent children. Will it ever stop? What can we do?
The problem with school shootings and copycatting is that we seem to obsess about the issue of school violence. On the anniversaries of school shootings, we see the images replayed on television, kids jumping out the windows, other kids embracing each other and consoling each other. Well, unfortunately, that plays right into the minds of the few kids who identify not with the victims and their pain, but with the perpetrators and their power. So the contagion of school shootings will eventually erode, but only if we let it.
I do think that we can reduce school shootings. That is a particular kind of mass murder that I think we can do something about. But we shouldn't wait until some youngster is being bullied to the point where he gets murderous intentions and wants to kill everybody at the school. Once a child is like that, it's too late. We should be getting at a child years earlier, as early as possible, when he is being bullied, when he is being humiliated on a daily basis, in the 3rd grade, in the 5th grade, in the 8th grade. And if we can get to him and give him a helping hand at that point, we will improve the quality of life for students everywhere, and in addition, we may actually prevent a few of these mass killings.